You don't belong here.
I just moved in.
I know exactly who lives in this neighborhood and who doesn't.
Okay.
I have relationships with the HOA, with the police department, people who take my calls seriously.
I appreciate the warning.
I appreciate the warning.
All right.
You won't last a month.
Lorraine Mercer had spent nearly 9 years deciding who belonged in Briarwood Estates, and she had made that decision about Damian Rowe before he finished unloading his first box. She saw plain clothes, an ordinary car, a man doing his own moving, and she built a verdict around what she thought that meant. What she didn't know was that Damian had spent 26 years inside the very system she was now threatening to use against him. What happens when you pick the wrong man, and he decides to let you prove exactly who you are? If stories like this one stay with you, the kind where patience turns out to be more powerful than noise, consider subscribing. There's more where this came from, and it's always free. The day Damian and Laurel Rowe moved into their home on Whitfield Court, the neighborhood of Briarwood Estates looked exactly the way it always had: clean sidewalks, trimmed hedges, and a particular kind of quiet that comes not from peace but from long-established habit. The houses were older here, well-maintained in the way that signals pride of ownership rather than recent renovation. Mature oak trees lined both sides of the street, and every mailbox was the same brushed silver model, because the HOA had decided some years ago that variety was a form of disorder. Damian carried boxes the same way he did everything else, methodically, without wasted motion. He wore a plain gray t-shirt and dark work pants, the kind of clothes chosen for function rather than appearance. Laurel walked alongside him, directing the placement of furniture with the practiced eye of someone who understood space for a living. She was an interior designer with a growing client list, and this house, with its high ceilings and natural light, had been the main reason they'd chosen Briarwood over 3 other neighborhoods they'd toured that spring. Across the street, Walter Pierce stood on his front porch with a coffee mug in both hands, watching the way older residents of quiet streets often do, not unfriendly, but not warm either, simply observing. When Damian glanced over and gave a short nod, Walter returned it, then looked down at his mug. He did not walk across the street to introduce himself. He did not wave Laurel over. He just stood there watching the way a man does when he has learned that the safest position in a neighborhood dispute is the one farthest from it. Several miles away at the Cedarfield Police Department, Officer Adrian Bell was at his desk, running through the morning's dispatch logs with the same careful attention he gave everything. He was younger than most of the senior officers, but he had a habit that set him apart. He read the full report, not just the summary. He cross-referenced names and addresses without being asked. His colleagues found it slightly excessive. Adrian considered it basic competence. That morning, the logs contained nothing unusual. That would change within the week. Back on Whitfield Court, Lorraine Mercer had already been watching for more than an hour. She stood slightly back from her front window, close enough to see clearly, far enough that no one could accuse her of staring. She had lived next door to that particular house for 11 years, had watched 2 families come and go, and had considered it her informal responsibility to maintain a certain standard of continuity on the block. She was the president of the Briarwood Estates Homeowners Association, had held the position for nearly 9 years, and she had spent that time building a clear picture of what the neighborhood was supposed to look like. The Rows did not fit that picture. She would have pointed to the moving truck, the ordinary sedan in the driveway, the way Damian carried his own boxes without any hired help. She would have dressed those observations in the language of community standards and property values. But the conclusion had come first, and the evidence had followed, the way it usually does when a verdict is made before the trial begins. She picked up her phone before the truck was even fully unloaded. The patrol car that arrived on Whitfield Court was driven by Adrian Bell, who happened to be closest to the area when the call came through a report of suspicious individuals moving items into a residence without clear ownership. He pulled up to the house, stepped out, and found Damien standing in his own front yard, holding a cardboard box paperwork already tucked under his arm, as though he had anticipated the question before it was asked. Damien presented his ID and the closing documents without being asked twice. Adrian reviewed them thoroughly, confirmed the address matched, confirmed the purchase date, confirmed the names. Everything was exactly as it should be. He handed the documents back with a quiet apology and returned to his car. Before he pulled away, he sat for a moment longer than necessary, his eyes moving to the house next door, where the curtain had not quite fallen back into place. Lorraine was waiting on the sidewalk by the time Damien set the box down on the porch steps. She had crossed the property line with the confidence of someone who considered property lines a formality. She told him in a measured and pleasant tone that one confirmed identity did not mean a new family was a good fit for the neighborhood. She mentioned her connection to the HOA board. She mentioned the city council. She mentioned more than once that she had close relationships with people in the Cedarfield Police Department, people who took her calls seriously and respected her judgment. She was not shouting. She was informing him of facts the way a landlord explains lease terms to a new tenant. Across the street, Walter Pierce heard every word. He was still on the porch. His coffee had gone cold. He watched Lorraine turn and walk back toward her front door. Watched Damien pick the box back up and carry it inside without saying a word in return. And then Walter turned and went inside too, pulling his screen door shut behind him, with a soft click that no one on the street would have noticed. What Lorraine took from Damien's silence was compliance, or perhaps fear. She had seen that reaction before: the tight jaw, the deliberate calm, the refusal to engage, and she had learned to read it as weakness. In her experience, the people who didn't fight back were the ones who eventually left. She went inside and made herself a cup of tea, and by evening she had already begun composing the next call in her mind. The calls came with a regularity that in any other context might have been almost administrative. Damien's car parked in his own driveway was reported as a suspicious vehicle. Laurel's afternoon music, soft instrumental tracks she played while reviewing client mood boards, was reported as a noise disturbance. A delivery driver who spent 4 minutes outside the house was reported as an unidentified individual loitering near a residential property. Adrian Bell responded to 2 of these. Each time he found nothing. Each time he wrote exactly what he found in his report. And each time he noted the address of the caller without comment, the way a careful person keeps records they aren't sure they'll need yet. The call that cost Laurel the most came on a Thursday afternoon in late September. She had a client meeting scheduled at the house, a retired couple looking to redesign their living and dining rooms. Good potential work, the kind of referral that leads to 3 more. They had been there for less than 20 minutes when a patrol car appeared at the curb. The officer who knocked was polite but thorough, asking about the nature of the gathering, whether any commercial services were being provided from the residents, whether the homeowner was aware of HOA regulations regarding in-home business operations. Laurel answered everything calmly. The officer left without incident. But the couple left too shortly after, with the particular discomfort of people who had not expected their afternoon to include a police visit. They did not reschedule. The project went to someone else. That evening, Damien came home to find Laurel at the kitchen table with her laptop closed and her sample binders stacked to the side untouched. She told him what had happened in a level voice that cost her something to maintain. She had been professional. She had answered every question. She had held everything together right up until the moment the client's car turned the corner and disappeared. Damien listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked her one question: whether she wanted to go next door right now. She said yes. He told her they were not going to do that. She looked at him. He pulled out the chair beside her and sat down, and he explained it not as a husband trying to manage her anger, but as someone who had spent 26 years watching situations like this develop and knowing exactly where they went wrong. What Lorraine was doing had a shape to it. Each call was designed to provoke a reaction, raised voices, a complaint filed against them. Something Lorraine could point to as evidence that the family she had decided didn't belong in Briarwood Estates was in fact a problem. The moment Damien or Laurel walked across that lawn and confronted her, they became the story. They became the disruptive neighbors. They gave her exactly what she needed. And Lorraine, Damien suspected, understood this very well. He told Laurel he was going to let it keep going. Not because he was afraid of Lorraine, and not because he intended to absorb the damage indefinitely, but because every call she made was a record. Every report was a document. Every officer who showed up and found nothing was a witness to the pattern, whether they recognized it yet or not. If Lorraine was doing what Damien believed she was doing, she was building a case against herself one phone call at a time, and the most important thing they could do was make sure no one interfered with that process, including themselves. He was not going to tell her who he was. He was not going to use his position to pressure her or the department. He was going to wait because patience was the one thing Lorraine had not accounted for. Laurel looked at the closed laptop for a long moment. Then she opened it and went back to work. What neither of them knew that night was that Adrian Bell had already started asking the question Lorraine had been counting on no one asking. It wasn't a formal inquiry, not yet. It was a habit, the same one that made him read the full report instead of the summary. He had pulled the call history for the Rose address. 8 calls in less than 3 weeks, all from the same number, all citing vague concerns that resolved to nothing upon arrival. It was the kind of data point that most people in the department had learned to overlook because the woman attached to that number had been calling in concerns from Briarwood Estates for years, and nobody wanted the headache of questioning someone with that many connections. Adrian wrote a note in his personal log, just the date, the hour, and the call count. He didn't file it anywhere. Not yet. But he did not throw the note away. The calls did not stop. If anything, they found a rhythm. Damien ran the same route every morning out the back gate left on Whitfield Court, down 3 blocks to the park path and back. It was something he had done for years, in every city he had lived in every season. He ran at an easy pace, always in the same lane, always visible. Within a week of establishing that routine, Lorraine had reported him twice as a suspicious individual moving through the neighborhood at irregular hours. Both times, a patrol car slowed beside him on the path. Both times, the officer looked him over, saw nothing unusual, and moved on. Damien kept running. Laurel had moved her client meetings outside the house entirely. She worked from a corner table at a coffee shop 2 miles away, spreading her sample books across the surface and apologizing to clients for the change in venue with a story about ongoing renovations. The work continued, but it had been reshaped around a threat that had no business existing. She did not complain about this to Damien, but he noticed the change, the way she gathered her bags differently in the morning. Faster, watchful, not quite relaxed in her own driveway anymore. The barbecue happened on a Saturday afternoon in early October. Damien had invited 2 neighbors from the far end of Whitfield Court, people they had met briefly during a walk one evening, who had been genuinely friendly and knew nothing of the situation next door. They grilled in the backyard, kept the music low, and were done by 5. Lorraine called at 3:15 to report unusual smoke and noise coming from the property. The officer who responded walked around to the back fence, saw 4 adults eating lunch in a private yard, wrote a report confirming no violation of any ordinance, and left. The neighbors stayed until sundown. No one mentioned the patrol car. But Damien noticed they did not suggest getting together again. On a Wednesday evening, Damien wheeled the trash bin to the curb, an unremarkable task, the sky still faintly orange at the edge. Lorraine called it in as an unknown individual moving between properties in low-light conditions. Sergeant Grant Pike took that call personally. He pulled into the cul-de-sac, climbed out of his cruiser, and swept a flashlight across Damien's face before Damien had even set the bin down. Grant was a heavy-set man in his mid-40s, the kind of officer who had been in the same department long enough that certain habits had calcified into policy. He told Damien in the tone of someone delivering a reasonable suggestion that given the volume of community concerns being raised about the address, it might be in everyone's best interest if Damien tried to limit activities that draw attention. Damien looked at him steadily. He asked in a tone just as level as Grant's whether there had been a complaint filed, whether there was any ordinance he was violating, and whether the sergeant was formally advising him to alter his behavior as a resident of the property he legally owned. Grant said nothing specific to any of those questions. He got back in his car and drove away. Damien stood in the driveway for a moment after the taillights disappeared, then went inside. He told Laurel about it while she was washing dishes, and she listened without turning around. When he finished, she set a glass down on the drying rack and said she was starting to wonder whether any of this was actually going to change. Damien understood the question underneath that one. She wasn't asking about Lorraine. She was asking about the department, the institution he was about to step into as its leader, and whether the people inside it were capable of seeing what was happening in front of them. He didn't answer right away, because the honest answer was that he wasn't sure yet. What he did know was that Grant Pike had not invented his attitude from nothing. That kind of comfortable deference to a particular voice in a community gets built slowly over years, one unanswered call at a time. Lorraine had made herself useful to people like Grant, and people like Grant had returned the favor without ever quite framing it that way. Adrian Bell was still keeping his notes. He had responded to several more calls from Lorraine's number in the weeks since his first log entry, and each one had resolved the same way: no violation, no threat, no evidence of anything other than a family living in a house they owned. The count was now at 10. He had started a second page cross-referencing each call with its recorded resolution. He had not shared the notebook with anyone. The unwritten rule around Lorraine Mercer was well understood in the department. Even if no one had ever stated it directly, she was connected, she was persistent, and pushing back on her complaints cost more energy than it was worth. Adrian was not the kind of person who found that argument convincing, but he was also not reckless. He was waiting for something that couldn't be explained away. He didn't know yet that Lorraine was about to give it to him. It happened on a Tuesday morning, a little before 9. Laurel had a client site visit scheduled across town and was loading her car with the tools of her work: a structured bag holding fabric samples, a rolled tube of floor plan drawings, a flat case of finish materials that she carried with both hands. She was focused, running slightly behind, thinking about the drive and the client and the questions she had prepared. She did not see Lorraine until she was already at the end of the front walk. Lorraine was standing on the narrow strip of grass between their 2 driveways, arms crossed as though she had been waiting. She told Laurel in that same measured tone she had used on the first day that she had been observing a pattern of commercial activity at the residence. Regular deliveries, unknown visitors, the movement of materials in and out that she believed was in violation of HOA regulations regarding home-based business operations. Laurel said she was on her way to a client appointment and did not have time for this conversation. She stepped to the side to get to her car. Lorraine reached out and took hold of her arm. It was not a violent grip. It was the grip of someone who considered herself entitled to be heard, who had never been told that her hand on another person's body was not a form of persuasion. The bag slipped from Laurel's shoulder and hit the driveway hard. The sample case skidded sideways. Fabric swatches fanned out across the concrete in a half-dozen directions, some of them landing in a thin puddle near the drain. Laurel pulled her arm free. She looked at Lorraine directly and told her in a voice that was quiet and entirely controlled that she was never to touch her again. Lorraine did not apologize. She said something about her responsibilities as HOA president, about the standards she was obligated to maintain. Laurel did not respond to any of it. She crouched down, gathered what she could reach, and got in her car. Walter Pierce was on his porch. He had seen it, all of it. He had seen Lorraine step into Laurel's path, seen the grab, seen the bag fall, seen Laurel pull away. He stood with his coffee going cold in his hands, watching until Laurel's car backed out, and drove off watching until Lorraine walked back inside and closed her door. Then he went inside too, the screen door tapping shut behind him, and the street was quiet again, as though nothing had happened. When Damien came home that evening, he found Laurel sitting on the living room floor, her back against the couch. The damaged samples spread around her in a loose circle. Some of the fabric had a gray smear across the corner that wouldn't come out. One of the mounted finish boards had a cracked edge. She had been trying to sort through what was salvageable, and she had stopped partway through. She looked up at him and said in a voice stripped of everything, except the fact itself that Lorraine had grabbed her arm in the driveway. Damien sat down on the floor beside her. He picked up one of the fabric swatches near his knee, a muted blue-gray wool, the kind used for formal sitting rooms, and held it. Then he said without looking up that he would handle it the right way. She looked at him, and something in the steadiness of his voice made her believe him in a way she hadn't quite managed to believe him before. Adrian Bell filed his report that same evening. He had received the incident report from the officer who had followed up with Laurel, a report that noted the physical contact, the dropped materials, the lack of any HOA authority to detain or restrain a resident. Adrian read it twice and then opened his own formal incident report. He documented the full count of calls, now at 11, the timeline, the consistent pattern of a single caller, reporting a single address with 0 substantiated outcomes, and the escalation to physical contact. He formally requested supervisory review and submitted it before he could talk himself out of it. He knew what it meant to put Lorraine Mercer's name at the top of a formal complaint in this department. He filed it anyway. By that point, Lorraine had already moved on to what she considered her most decisive step. She sat at her kitchen table that same night with a sheet of HOA letterhead and composed a formal complaint addressed to 3 separate offices: the City Council, the Mayor's office, and the incoming Chief of Police at the Cedarfield Police Department. The letter was thorough. It described the Rowe family as disruptive residents whose presence had created ongoing concerns for the community, unsanctioned business activity, excessive foot traffic noise, smoke from outdoor cooking individuals on the property at irregular hours. She listed every incident she had reported, treating each one as established fact. She requested that the incoming chief personally review the situation and take appropriate action to restore order to the neighborhood. She signed it in full: Lorraine Mercer, President, Briarwood Estates Homeowners Association. She folded the letter into an envelope, sealed it, and set it on the table to be mailed in the morning. She had no way of knowing she had just sent a formal complaint about herself directly to the man it was meant to harm. The morning of the 12th call was cold and clear, the kind of November morning where the light arrives sharp and low and makes everything on the street look more defined than usual. Damien was up before 6. He had a leadership meeting at the department that afternoon. His first formal session with senior staff since the appointment had been finalized, and he had spent the previous evening pulling together the materials he needed. Internal assessment reports, budget documents, incident review files, and personnel data that had been forwarded to him in advance. He stacked it all into 4 uniform boxes the night before and carried them out to the car one at a time in the early quiet of the morning. He had made 2 trips when he heard Lorraine's front door open. She was standing in her doorway, in a housecoat, watching him load the boxes into the back seat of his car. He did not look over. He went back inside for the 3rd box, came back out, and by the time he set it in place, she had already gone back inside. He thought nothing of it. He went in for the 4th box. He was closing the rear door when he heard the cruiser. Grant Pike pulled in at an angle that blocked the driveway, not an accident, not a precaution, but a deliberate positioning that Damien recognized immediately as a containment technique. Grant stepped out without hurry, one hand already resting near his belt, and told Damien to step away from the vehicle and keep his hands where they could be seen. Damien stepped back from the car. He kept his hands at his sides, visible still. Grant told him there had been a report of suspicious materials being loaded into a vehicle at this address, possible removal of stolen property. Damien said evenly that the boxes contained work documents, internal files he was transporting to an office meeting. Grant said he was going to need to verify that. Damien said he understood, and he stood quietly while Grant walked to the rear door and opened it without asking permission. Grant looked at the boxes. He pulled the top off the nearest one and looked inside at the stacked files and folders. Then he said he was going to need to open all of them. Damien opened them. Grant looked through each one with the thoroughness of a man who was certain he would find something, and the particular frustration of a man who kept not finding it. When he reached the 3rd box, he put his hand on the side of the lid and pushed it off the car seat. The box tilted, dropped, and hit the concrete driveway with a flat crack. A rubber-banded stack of files slid out and splayed open. Documents spread across the cold driveway, in a fan, some of them drifting into the frost, still sitting along the edge of the curb. Grant looked at the papers on the ground. Then he looked at Damien. He said that if Damien was going to have a problem with a lawful inspection, he could call for additional units. Damien looked at the documents lying on the concrete driveway of his own home in front of a car that had been positioned to prevent him from leaving, because a woman next door had picked up the phone and described cardboard boxes as suspicious materials. He thought about the 11 calls before this one. He thought about Laurel on the living room floor, surrounded by ruined samples. He thought about the letter Lorraine had mailed to the incoming chief of police, the letter he had received at the department 2 days earlier, the one requesting that he personally investigate the disruptive family on Whitfield Court, signed with her full name and title, and he thought about the fact that she still did not know he was the person who had read it. He reached slowly into his jacket pocket. Grant's posture shifted, shoulders square, weight forward, hand no longer just resting near his belt. Damien moved deliberately, the way someone moves when they understand exactly what their movement looks like to the person watching it, and they choose to move that way anyway because they refuse to be hurried. He took out a slim leather wallet and opened it. The badge caught the morning light. The words were clean and clear: Chief of Police, Cedarfield Police Department. Damien stated his full name. He said it without inflection, without the satisfaction of watching it land, and it landed anyway. Grant stood very still. The hand dropped from his belt. The color in his face went through several changes in the span of a few seconds. He began to say something, an apology, the beginning of an explanation, and Damien let him get 2 sentences in before he asked the question that ended the conversation. He asked what would have happened if he were not the chief of police. Grant did not answer. Damien did not need him to. He told Grant to return to the department and to have every record associated with the 12 calls made from the address. Recordings written. Reports, officer notes, dispatch logs on his desk before noon. Then he crouched down and began gathering the documents from the driveway himself, stacking them back into the box with the same methodical care he brought to everything. Grant got in his car and drove away. When Damien arrived at the department, the first person he called into his office was Adrian Bell. Adrian came in carrying his formal report, along with the personal notebook he had been keeping since the first call. He set both on the desk without being asked. Damien read the notebook first, then the report, then looked up and told him simply that he had done the right thing. Adrian said he knew. He also said that 2 senior officers had informally advised him to let the Mercer situation resolve on its own, because she had a long history with the department, and making it formal would create friction that nobody wanted. Damien asked who had advised him. Adrian told him. Damien wrote the names down. The complete records of all 12 calls were on his desk by 11:30. He read through them in order, and what he found confirmed what he had watched develop from his own driveway over 5 weeks. In isolation, each call could be read as a concerned neighbor acting on a reasonable worry. Stacked together with their dates and resolutions listed side by side, they read as something else entirely. 12 reports, 12 responses, 12 confirmed non-events, 1 address, 1 caller. He forwarded the complete file to the district attorney's office that afternoon. Assistant District Attorney Elise Marlowe reviewed it within 48 hours and opened a formal investigation. When her office pulled Lorraine's full call history, not just the past 5 weeks, but the full record going back years. What they found gave the current pattern a much longer shadow. Delivery drivers reported as suspicious. Repair workers questioned on job sites. A real estate agent flagged while showing a neighbor's home. Families who had moved into the neighborhood and within months had moved back out. The calls followed the same logic each time someone Lorraine had decided did not fit reported to a system that had never been asked to look at whether the calls themselves were the problem. The HOA records told a parallel story. Residents Lorraine liked received informal warnings before any official action was taken. Residents she didn't like received written notices and fines for the same categories of violation. The documentation was all there filed neatly in the association's own records, because Lorraine had never imagined anyone would read it looking for a pattern rather than individual cases. Grant Pike was placed on administrative leave pending an internal affairs review. The 2 senior officers who had told Adrian to stand down were called into Damien's office separately on the same afternoon and left those meetings understanding clearly that the culture of deferring to well-connected complainants was not going to continue. A community meeting was held on a Thursday evening at the Cedarfield Civic Center, 3 weeks after the morning in the driveway. The room was fuller than expected. Many of the residents had never seen Damien in anything other than the work clothes he had been wearing on the day he moved in. He walked in that evening in his full-dress uniform, and the room adjusted to the information quietly, the way a room does when something it has been told and something it is seeing for the first time finally match. Lorraine was not present. Several of her longtime allies in the HOA were, and they sat near the back without speaking. Damien stood at the front of the room without notes. He said he was not there to talk about Lorraine Mercer or about himself, or about what had happened in his driveway on a November morning. He said the real question, the one worth answering, in front of the people who actually lived in this community, was how someone could call the police 12 times about the same innocent family without anyone in the system stopping to ask whether the caller was the problem. He said the honest answer was that systems allow it when the people inside them weigh the credibility of a complaint based on who is making it rather than what it says. Then he stepped back from the podium. What followed lasted nearly 2 hours. People came to the microphone one at a time. A contractor who had been reported as a suspicious individual while completing a licensed job at a neighbor's home. A woman who had moved her mother in for post-surgery recovery and had received 4 HOA citations in 3 months. A family who had sold their home on Whitfield Court 4 years earlier after a sustained campaign of complaints that had made the neighborhood feel uninhabitable. They were not angry, most of them. They were tired in the way people are tired when they have been carrying something for a long time and have finally found a room where it is safe to set it down. Damien proposed a formal protocol change before the meeting closed. If a single caller generated more than a defined number of unsubstantiated reports about the same individual or address within a rolling 90-day period, the system would flag it for mandatory supervisory review before any further response was dispatched. It was not a complicated change. It required only that someone had decided the pattern mattered as much as the individual call. The protocol was adopted 2 months later. Lorraine did not seek re-election to the HOA presidency. The announcement came through the association's standard newsletter, a single line at the bottom of the agenda section, without explanation. The house next door to the Rose went on the market in early spring and sold within 3 weeks. Laurel opened her design studio in a rented space 4 blocks from Briarwood Estates in February. It was a small room with good light and 2 work tables, and on the corner of her primary desk, she had placed a narrow wooden frame containing a swatch of blue-gray wool fabric, the piece she had picked up off the driveway, the one with the faint gray smear on the corner that had never quite come out. She had thought about replacing it with a cleaner sample. She had decided not to. It wasn't there to remind her of Lorraine. It was there to remind her of the day she and Damien decided together, and without anger, that they were not going to be moved. Damien still ran the same route every morning. No patrol cars slowed beside him on the path. Neighbors on Whitfield Court had started to wave. Walter Pierce came to their door on a Saturday morning in late March, when the oak trees were just beginning to leaf out. He had a look on his face that Damien recognized, not shame exactly, but the particular discomfort of a person who has been holding something and has finally decided the weight of it is greater than the difficulty of putting it down. Walter said he had seen what happened in the driveway that Tuesday morning. Lorraine stepping into Laurel's path, the grip the bag falling, Laurel pulling away. He said he had known it was wrong. He had stood there long enough to intervene, and he had gone inside anyway, because he had spent 9 years in that neighborhood watching what happened to people who got in Lorraine's way. Damien listened without interrupting. When Walter finished, Damien told him he understood. He said he wasn't angry. Then he said plainly that the next time Walter saw something like that, he should not go inside. Walter nodded. He thanked Damien for listening and walked back across the street. The new neighbors arrived on a Saturday in May. The moving truck was large, and the couple directing the movers was young and visibly excited about the house. Boxes came off the truck in a steady stream and disappeared inside. The scene was familiar in the particular way that beginnings always resemble each other. No curtain moved in the windows along Whitfield Court. No one picked up a phone. Laurel came out of her front door, carrying a small basket, a bottle of olive oil, a loaf of bread from the bakery on Cedar Street, a handwritten card with their phone number on it. She walked across the lawn and introduced herself to the couple on the porch, and they thanked her in the slightly overwhelmed way of people who did not expect a welcome on the first day and were genuinely surprised to receive one. The story had begun with someone looking out a window and deciding that a stranger was a problem. It ended with someone walking across a lawn and deciding that a stranger was a neighbor. That was the only difference between the two, the decision. And the decision, it turned out, was something anyone could make. What Damien understood, and what this story keeps proving, is that dignity doesn't wait for permission. It doesn't announce itself with a title or a badge or a resume. It was there in the way he picked the box back up on the first day. It was there in Laurel's voice when she said quietly and without trembling, "Don't touch me again." It was there in Adrian's decision to file the report anyway, knowing the cost. And it was there in Walter imperfect late, but finally choosing not to look away. None of them were heroic in the obvious sense. They were just people who decided at different moments, and for different reasons, that the right thing was worth the discomfort of doing it. We don't always get to know who the person in front of us actually is. We don't always get the moment where the badge comes out and the room goes quiet. Most of the time, we just have the choice to extend decency or to withhold it, to assume the worst or to walk across the lawn. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories like this one about quiet strength, about systems and the people who push back on them, about the small decisions that turn out to matter, subscribe. Every single story here is free and there's always another one coming.